All right, I just want to make a quick video now. This is about tapes, cassette tapes, audio tapes. All right, cassette tape. There is the cassette revival that's going on. That has going on. The resurgence of interest in the cassette tape. That the heyday of cassette. The cassette tape. The heyday of the cassette tape. The golden era of the cassette tape. The golden age of the cassette was through the 1980s. In 1979, Sony introduced the Walkman. And even though they were still making cassette 8-track in 1979, the boombox maybe evolved and came out around 1978 or so as well. So boomboxes and Walkmans and car stereos were the big thing that made cassette have a serious advantage over the record. It had a major advantage over the record because it was portable. Number one thing that brought the cassette to the top, that made cassette with youth in the 80s. Now, in the 1980s, I don't know what age you were in the 1980s. You could have been a child in the 1980s, a little child. You could have been a middle-aged, a baby boomer like my mom. In the 1980s, to understand any decade, you have to understand who the people were that fulfilled roles in the society in the 80s. Now, the grandparents, the people were just getting to the retirement age and that were retiring, that had started retiring, that already retired, that started retiring. People that were grandparents, becoming grandparents in the 80s were people who fought in World War II. People that grew up in the Great Depression fought in World War II. People that would have been teenagers on that show, The Waltons, Those people that were teenagers in the 30s, like my granddad that I lived with. He was a teenager in the 30s. During the Great Depression, he was a teenager in the Great Depression in the 30s. He wasn't just a little kid in the Great Depression in the 30s. He was a teenager in the 30s. My granddad was, And so, the parents of the kids that go to school have parents in the 80s. And the parents in the 80s, just like on the Goldbergs, who was the mother? The mothers and fathers of little kids growing up in the 80s are baby boomers. That's who the parents are in the 80s. The kids' parents are in the 80s. A lot of things in the 80s were considered retro. And the big retro was coming around in the 70s and 80s. And in the 80s, the big retro was of the 50s and early 60s. It was the throwback. Today we have a throwback of the 80s and maybe even starting to have a retro throwback to the 90s. Like a resurgence of interest in the 80s and 90s. But, it's partially for the young people, but partially for adult, parental age people, my age, to reminisce and rediscover their youth, People that were baby boomers started restoring 69 Camaros and 66 Mustangs because it was the cars that they had when they were 16 years old. People in the 80s were having a resurgence like movies like Dirty Dancing. Movies like Dirty Dancing was for people in the baby boomers that were parents that were 30 years old, 40 years old in the 80s. They were the parents of kids, and they were starting to relive their youth with the, great that stuff, Hold on, I'm making a video. I'll be right back. Okay, and so cassette tape rose to power with the aid of, car stereos were 8-track in the 70s. And in the 70s, the majority, 90% of the cheap stereos that you would buy at Walmart, where you buy a stereo at Walmart, it would have been an 8-track, 9 times out of 10. If you had a home stereo with a tape deck in a home stereo in the 70s, or a tape deck in a car in the 70s, it would have been 8-track. A cassette was around, and it was for dictation use only in the 60s. But in the late 60s, they started making pre-recorded music on cassette. And even though it was available, just like in the 70s or early 80s, you still had reel-to-reel. You had pre-recorded albums released on reel-to-reel in the 70s, but that was mostly in the 60s that people listened to music on pre-recorded reel-to-reel as an alternative to a record. But in the 80s, young people had records in the 80s, but you have to understand it was losing popularity with young people. Records were the standard. They were the old reliable standby in the 80s. Records were the old reliable standby. Everybody's stereo had a record player on it in the 80s, no matter whose stereo it was. Even a cheap stereo from Walmart in the 80s would have had a record player on it. There was just something that goes with a stereo, a home stereo. But with kids, the rising interest was cassette, and everybody wanted a cassette because kids in the 80s had boom boxes. No matter what kid you are in the 80s, you have a boom box and a Walkman. That's what you have. It's a cassette player Walkman in the 80s. And in 1988, people were used to cassettes in 1988. But by 1989, every kid was talking about CD. By 1991, all kids were talking about CDs in 1991. Sure, it was part of the great cassette time period in the 90s. And when we look back on the throwback retro of the 80s and 90s, you think of the 90s as being cassette. But in 1992, Christmas 1992, I got my first cassette CD player. I got my first CD player in Christmas 1992. That was my first CD player. And by 1995, a lot of people still listen to cassettes. But, you have the Bible on cassette. You have church sermons on cassette. By 1995, a lot of people still listen to cassette. But by the year 2000, I really felt like an old fogey in the year 2000, still listening to cassette. In 2001, I got a CD recorder. It was a home stereo CD player that burnt CDs. It burnt CDRs. It was a home stereo CD player, component CD player that burnt CDs, digital audio CDRs. And in 2001, I started converting all of my cassettes over to CD by burning them onto CD. And in the year 2001, downloading music and YouTube music and all this stuff didn't exist, And maybe you could burn CDs and music in 2001, but I was always last to pick up on anything. So I think I was kind of late in the game because I went to high school. When I was in high school in 1991, a lot of kids were switching over to CD in 1990 and 1991. In the late 80s, they called it a compact disc player. You would call it a compact disc player. And the CDs would come in a really long, skinny box. And the CDs at one end and the booklets at the other end. And so before they had a lot of digital devices to put on CDs in a store, for security, CDs and stuff, they put them in a long case. They would put tapes and CDs into a long case so you wouldn't be able to walk out of the store with it. Now we have these little electronic devices that we stick on CDs and stuff. And we have a scanner in the door of a grocery store, Walmart. So you walk out to the door of the Walmart, this big magnetic things that you walk through as you go into the door of the Walmart, and this alarm goes off as you walk out the door of Walmart because that little electronic device is stuck on the CD, a little stick-on thing, and you walk out the door and the magnetic things, it hits those things. And, in the 80s, they didn't have that. They didn't have those electronic stick-on things that they put on CDs in a store. It's a little bitty thing, a little electronic thing that you stick on the CD in the store, and then you have the magnetic scanner, magnetic hoop things that you walk that are on either side of the door when you walk out of Walmart. The electronic thing you walk in between, those didn't exist. They didn't have those things back then. So they had the CDs and cassettes and had to put them into even cassettes. Even 8-tracks went into these long cases. It was a plastic thing, and the 8-tracks. This long thing, and you would have, and at the register, they had a key, and they would open up this long thing. This long thing it was about this long, and the cassette only goes at one end, or 8-track only goes at one end of it, and the other thing is empty, like a plastic frame thing, or even a long cardboard box that the CD came in. But basically, they didn't have that kind of a theft deterrent system, electronic theft deterrent systems in the 80s. Electronic theft deterrent system that when you walk out of the store, this buzzer goes off. They didn't have that then. They didn't have stuff like that back then. If you have watches and expensive stuff, they just keep it in behind a case, and you would pay for it in the jewelry department or wherever you went to. They just pull it out of the case and you pay for it. Then now they have all this stuff sitting out in the store, and they have electronic devices that makes an alarm go off when you go out the door, go woo 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 when you walk out. But basically, in the 80s was the heyday of cassette, and in the 90s, the beginning of rap music, the birth of rap music. These people, I mean, the advantages of cassette in the 70s and 80s, it gave people independent, low budget, home produced music. Garage bands, independent rap artists that would take James Brown, and they would sample James Brown, and they would rap to it. They'd take little pieces of stuff and rap to it, and play it, and sample stuff, and they would put stuff together and rap over it. That's what they would do, and it gave the independent music producer the ability to be on the same level as Elvis. Elvis would come out on a tape. The independent low budget independent garage band or rapper would be on a tape. It would give the ability to people the ability to produce their own albums on the same format as the big singers. Whereas low budget independent rappers and and garage bands in the 70s and 80s, you couldn't make a real album because, you know, independent low budget people don't have the money to cut a record. You have to cut 1,000 copies of a record in order for them to be able to produce a record album, a vinyl record. They only produce them in large quantities. I mean, if you're an independent low budget producer of music, your major advantage is you can produce 50 copies like that. Daniel Johnson, that independent outsider music, you can produce 50 or 100 copies of your homemade self-produced album, rap album in the 70s in New York City, or your independent rock and roll garage band. They can produce low quantities and make things themselves. You can produce it yourself cheap, and you can be on the same level as a real artist by being on the same format. That's another advantage, the access of producing, recording music yourself. That's the advantage of cassette record over records and CDs. Thank you for watching.